there should be a question, why is all this stuff in Holland and not in Indonesia? So we have to get used to think otherwise and to think about bringing everything back and how to deal with all the problems that come with it. And as we discussed before, it's not only like you give back objects that have been stolen, it's giving back a history, the history that comes with the objects. And for that, we have a group of speakers who are really deeply involved in the subject and very knowledgeable, and they have been studying and working with it for the past decades. And I can introduce to you Evelien Campfens, who's a researcher at the University of Leiden, has been involved in returning objects that had been stolen by the Nazis. So it's a very similar story, but different. She can explain that. We have Jos van Beurden, who is a researcher at the de Vrije Universiteit, the Free University of Amsterdam, who wrote a book about it, and he is very much involved in the whole background of returning artifacts to former colonies. And then we have Sri Margana, who is holding the Van Leur chair at the University van Leiden and is also a lecturer at UGM, Universitas Gadjah Mada. And we also have Mr. Abi Kusno, who's responsible for the return of artifacts from the Ministry of Culture in Indonesia. And all these people will hold a talk, and I'm sure it's going to be very interesting. And after that, we can ask questions and we can get into a discussion about all the topics that come up. And I think we start with Evelien Campfens, sorry. And she will hold a talk about restitution rules and regulations and the legal framework. Evelien Campfens.
Yes, thank you, Michel, and thank you all. And I'm very honored to be here. Actually, I'm not a specialist in Indonesian history, and actually my presentation, I'm afraid, will also not focus specifically on Indonesian artifacts, as I simply, I discussed that I will give a kind of general legal overview, which is, 15 minutes is quite short for that because it's a really complicated field. And it's exactly what Michel said. I mean, most people say, it's not our, it's stolen, it's not our ownership, it's stolen property, we have to return it. But here you have exactly the difficult point is that when you look at these cases from the perspective of ownership laws, there you get into a kind of legal labyrinth that soon will obstruct all these kind of claims because they're still, and each country has its own ownership law. So what I will do is give a perspective of how international regulations account for it, more or less. And then again, even 15 minutes is not enough for a crash course, but let me give it a try. Now, looting and pillage. Can I have the first slide, please? Or should I do it myself? I thought someone... Yes, were you going to do my slides for me? Yes? Could I have the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I just thought to start out with, with the idea, what is looting and the idea that is at the top of everybody's mind, it's something of all times, and our museums are full of looted art, and that's definitely true, because, for example, this centerpiece of the Prada, the Garden of Earthly Delights, was once upon a time it was part of the palace of William of Orange, and it was looted from that palace in the 16th century by the Duke of Alba. And then I also have this clipping. There's this petition, a plea that a group of Dutch people say, well, that is ours, it's our Jeroen Bos, so it should be returned to the Netherlands. I think we should not take that too seriously, because at the time in the 16th century, no real rules, clear rules existed in international law. And besides also, it has come to be part also of the Spanish cultural heritage. Could I have the next slide, please? I'm not sure if I can do it myself, but thank you. Yeah. So yeah, looting is something of all times, but the rules that prohibit looting of cultural objects and render them a special protected status are also very old. So one of the founders of international law, our Dutch Hugo Grotius, for example, wrote already in the 17th century that there are some things of such a nature which reason itself requires to be spared even during the heat of war, and such are elegant works and monuments of art. So what he's saying here is really the intangible heritage value makes them kind of immune under international law. Now, the Napoleonic Wars are generally seen as a turning point in this development of rules. Not that Napoleon respected the prohibition to plunder, quite the opposite. What made this a turning point is that after his final defeat, the European powers confirmed at the Congress of Vienna that their return on the basis of territoriality after plunder was a principle of justice amongst civilized nations. At the time, they said it like that. Not winners takers, but return to source communities, thus gradually became the rule for looted artifacts. Now, at the very same moment, of course, a run was taking place on antiquities and ethnological artifacts from other places in the world. However, those objects were generally not returned. Here, the weak point of international law surfaces. For too long, rules were only applied to a limited group of Western nations. The claim to the Parthenon marbles, could I have the next slide, please? So the claim to the Elgin or Parthenon marbles, everybody has heard about it, has surfaced as the historic restitution claim that for the last decades, actually, since the end of the 1970s, is on the agenda of the special UNESCO committee, Intergovernmental Committee for Return and Restitution of Cultural Objects, and it has still not been resolved. Now, advocates of return say that the integrity of archaeological monuments in situ and as a unity is important here. And the opponents say that the major universal museums are the best place for such treasures, and wide public access and preservation of cultural objects are the public interest at stake. And that was for very long the guiding rule, actually. That was the reaction of Western countries to claims from other countries for their treasures. We are the best, we can best take care of them. Now, we're opponents of return of the marbles. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So where opponents of return of the marbles argue that they were not looted, but taken lawfully and with some kind of permission of the Ottoman Sultan that then was occupying Greece, this is very different for seizures during colonial military expeditions. The Benin bronzes, for example, and the Lombok treasure, the Indonesian example, are famous examples in that category. Another example, which is on the next slide, that I'm personally more aware or I'm more knowledgeable about because I'm involved in this case, concerns a wooden statue known as the Bangwa Queen that today is in Paris. You see it there on the left up. She's an iconic work of art, and in the 1930s she was photographed by Man Ray, and she featured in a number of exhibitions, like this one in 1935, and an exhibition like the ones that were made at the time in the 1920s in Berlin. On the next slide, if I could have the next slide, I'm not sure if I can do it myself, yes, yeah, thank you. So she started her life in the Bangwa area in the western part of today's Cameroon. She is an ancestor figure, so-called Les Femmes figure, and she was to be kept hidden in the shrine of the ruling king, here, Von Asangyani on the right. She is sacred to the Bangwa, a community that keeps its traditional ways of life, even though members of this community have dispersed over the world. They are still believing that these are ancestral sculptures that are sacred. In 1899, the Bangwa Queen and many other Bangwa sculptures were dispatched to Berlin by German colonial agents. The Bangwa are certain that she was looted in the course of the military colonial actions that happened those years. And the ruling chief was sent in exile and his quarters were burned down, as happened in such actions in many places around the world. Now, German publications, however, argue they were handed over voluntarily. In 2011, next slide, please. She was exhibited in New York at this Heroic Africans, Legendary Leaders, Iconic Sculptures, a very apt name for this exhibition. So she was exhibited there in New York and she was recognized by the Bangwa. And after that, contact was sought with the French owner, who refused to discuss the matter even until today. And in the same way, the Berlin museums, where the many Bangwa statues still remain, did not react on the request to meet. The reaction by the Bangwa representative that I think speaks volumes says that refusing to meet with us is a preference for a confrontational solution. Now, being that as it is, what about the Bangwa's rights? What about the legal framework? It is often heard, could I have the next slide? Thank you. So it is often heard that no legal standards exist in this, for these cases, but I think there are. The question is, what law do we apply? Under Bangwa customs and rules, these sculptures were inalienable, could not be privately owned or sold. And on the other hand, under local or French or German property law, without any doubt, such claims will be still today, and they have become legal, lawful possessions of the new owners. From the perspective of international law, then again, one could make very well the argument, I think, that looting in the course of military actions at the close of the 19th century was unlawful, also under standards of the time. Here I gave an overview. So in 1899, at exactly the same moment that she was looted, the first multilateral convention was signed in the Hague Regulations, and it said seizure, just as Hugo Grotius had done before, seizure of or destruction of works of art is forbidden and should be made the subject of legal proceedings. So it was a codification of existing law. So my point is, I think that at that moment it was unlawful under the standards of international law. Nevertheless, any legal claim based on events that took place so long ago and the unlawfulness of these events at the time will encounter a range of legal obstacles. And besides, often the exact circumstances are unknown. My point is then, do rules exist that focus on present-day interests? And my answer to that is yes, I think there are. For some time, if I could have the next slide, please. Yeah, for some time, and I'm going into a kind of legal or background of the developments, the legal developments in human rights law, actually. Because for some time one can witness what may be called a humanization of international cultural property law. And this comes down to the acknowledgement that cultural heritage is a necessary ingredient for the realization of human rights. And this brings with it a focus on the social meaning of cultural objects. Now, for example, in this sense, the UN Human Rights Council argued in a number of declarations over the last years that cultural heritage is an important component of the cultural identity of communities, groups and individuals, and of social cohesion. Now, this clearly moves away from a focus on the scientific value of cultural objects that lies at the heart of the argument that universal museums are the best place for cultural objects and only preservation is the public interest that should count. And another example, for example, is the 2005 FADO Convention that's on the value of cultural heritage for society, that defines cultural heritage as a group of resources inherited from the past, which people identify with independently of ownership as a reflection and an expression of their constantly evolving values, beliefs, knowledge, and traditions. And a third point of central importance to our topic is the development of the right of access to culture. This developed from the general binding right to a human right to culture on Article 15 in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Now, although this may still sound rather vague and unspecific, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People of 2007 is very specific in its obligations. Indigenous peoples in this respect have the right to redress through effective mechanisms, which may include restitution with respect to cultural property taken without their free, prior and informed consent. A right to access, use and control of their ceremonial objects, and a straightforward right to repatriation of objects containing human remains. Now, the UNDRIP, while on itself it's a non-binding declaration, is considered by now the implementation of the binding human right to culture in as far as it concerns indigenous peoples. In other words, it is very important for colonial takings, in my view. And in that sense, for example, in a 2017 Colombian court case, the Supreme Court of Colombia judged that under today's standards of international law, indigenous peoples are entitled to their lost cultural objects. And it concerned the so-called Quimbaya treasure. It's down there on the right. It's a golden treasure that was taken also very long ago from the Quimbaya indigenous people, and today is in Spain. So the court said, Colombian government, you have to, on behalf of your people of this community, you have to go to Spain and you have to demand back and work towards restitution. Now, these developments brought me to the notion of a heritage title as opposed to an ownership title. So it's a kind of legal tool to get towards these identity values that I think are at the heart of these cases. Now, this model for claims relies on three elements. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Yes, so first, on a verifiable continuing cultural link between people and their cultural objects that they identify with, and not to be able to access or control one's heritage, may implicate then a continuing violation of human rights. And a second difference with a normal ownership approach is that the rights involved are defined in terms of access, control, return, or equitable solutions, and not in terms of exclusive ownership. And this means a shift in focus from the unlawfulness of the events in the past and to having to prove that, and all kind of jurisdictional problems, to present day interests. Now, a third element that I think is interesting here is that it allows for a classification of cultural objects, depending on their identity value and social function. And then that social function may also enable other solutions than just restitution of ownership rights, depending on the function it has and the identity values involved. Now, sacred objects or human remains obviously score very high on this scale, whilst artifacts intended for the trades do less so. And as a last point that I think why this concept may be useful in this field is because it enables access to justice. So the weighing of legal claims through universally applicable human rights. Now to conclude, if I can have the next slide. Oh no, you can leave this also, I think. Well, so developments are going so fast in this field, and the law is evolving. And it's very difficult to say the law is at this moment like that, because the more lawyers you will talk to, the more views you will get. I think it's going this direction. And from that perspective also, if you look at the rules of the UNDRIP, for example, the policy guidelines that are adopted to enable the return of colonial collections in the Netherlands or in Germany or in other countries may well be seen as a forebode of evolving law. Moreover, setting up procedures to address claims may also be seen as the fulfillment of obligations that states like the Netherlands took upon themselves by signing instruments such as the UNDRIP. Now, it's often stated that claims in this field are a matter of morality, not of the law. And although I completely agree that a legalistic approach is not the answer to restoring injustices of the past, I also believe that injustice should be a matter of justice in the end, and access to justice is important in that regard. So that was my presentation. I hope I stayed within the 15 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. I didn't look at the clock that much. I just wanted you to finish because it was very interesting to get all these points, especially the heritage title you came up with. I think that's what everybody here wants to discuss more than just the ownership title. So, but I give now the podium to Adrian, who will give a summary in Indonesian for the people who don't speak English.
Okay, thank you well, Pak Michael. Selamat malam untuk teman-teman di Indonesia. Presentasi tadi banyak sekali hal-hal yang menarik didiskusikan bahwa bagaimana pembicara ingin memberikan penjelasan singkat terkait kerangka hukum ya atau kerangka legal dari warisan-warisan budaya atau objek-objek budaya yang mengalami kontestasi, khususnya yang mengalami perebutan gitu ya dalam konteks postkolonial hari ini. Dan kalau kita lihat sejak awal urusan kepemilikan masalah objek-objek budaya ini memang sudah lama terjadi gitu ya, sudah lama berlangsung. Seperti misalnya tadi disebutkan satu karya seni yang sangat menarik tentang The Garden of Earthly Delights dari seorang seniman, Jeroen Bosch, yang menjadi salah satu masterpiece dari Museum Prado di Madrid. Nah, itu sekarang menjadi masterpiece di Madrid, padahal itu awalnya diambil di Brussels oleh seorang pangeran dari istananya Willem Oranje itu ya. Nah, tapi sampai hari ini bagaimana kepemilikannya? Nah, ini masih terjadi bahkan di Eropa sekalipun. Kemudian juga sebenarnya kalau berbicara tentang masalah hukum internasional, seorang salah satu peletak dasar bagi keilmuan hukum internasional, Hugo Grotius. Saya sendiri baru kenal Hugo Grotius itu hanya hukum maritimnya saja, tapi ini tadi ternyata juga di dalam traktat yang ditulis ya oleh Grotius di abad ke-17 bahwa ternyata objek-objek budaya itu sudah harus diperhatikan bahkan di kala peperangan sekalipun. Nah, kemudian dari sini kemudian berkembang terus, seperti misalnya kita tahu yang sangat banyak dibicarakan adalah terkait marmer-marmer dari kuil Parthenon di Yunani. Nah, itu beberapa kelompok pro tapi tidak sedikit juga yang kontra untuk masalah pengembaliannya. Apakah harus dikembalikan atau tidak? Mereka yang percaya bahwa ini harus dikembalikan, koleksi-koleksi yang hari ini ada di Museum Nasional Inggris tersebut di London, bahwa barang atau objek budaya tersebut merupakan suatu kesatuan utuh dari monumen arkeologis. Jangan yang menolaknya bahwa harusnya Elgin Marble itu disimpan ya memang di museum yang universal. Diberi contoh lain misalnya bagaimana patung dari Bangwa, tadi patung kayu. Kemudian juga bagaimana kemudian harus bertindak terhadap itu. Pembicara kemudian memberikan semacam pandangan lain bahwa ternyata dari Mahkamah PBB untuk masalah human rights gitu ya, terutama di pengakuan terhadap masyarakat adat itu sudah ada deklarasinya yang tadi disebutkan UNDRIP itu bisa menjadi salah satu solusi gitu ya untuk memecahkan masalah ini. Dan dari situ dari UNDRIP tadi Declaration of Rights, hak-hak masyarakat adat itu ternyata bisa dipakai misalnya di Kolombia. Bagaimana kemudian masyarakat adat Kumbaya gitu ya meminta mengajukan kasus pengambilan objek-objek budayanya ke pengadilan Kolombia melalui jalan ini, dan akhirnya dipenuhi oleh hakim di pengadilan tinggi Kolombia, dan akhirnya meminta pemerintah untuk secara resmi secara formal meminta barang-barang tersebut untuk dikembalikan. Nah, model-model inilah nanti yang menarik untuk didiskusikan pada sesi tanya jawab. Oke, Pak Michael.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Adrian. So, now we go on with Mr. Jos van Beurden, researcher at the Vrije Universiteit, the Free University of Amsterdam. And he will bring us up to date to the more recent historical events between especially the Netherlands and Indonesia, and the talks and the steps that have been made in the recent past about this restitution of objects. So Jos van Beurden.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michel, and it's a pleasure to talk here, and thank you to Jos and the other organizers of this meeting. While Evelien has been talking about legal aspects and international law, I will focus more on the historical aspects of the relationship between Indonesia and the Netherlands. And the title of the webinar, in the title, the words long and winding are there. And long and winding, they were indeed, it took the two countries over a quarter century to come to an agreement about new cultural relations and the restitution of a number of objects. Whereas, for instance, Belgium and the Democratic Republic of Congo, they needed maybe 10 years. Australia and Papua New Guinea did it in a few years. Now, why did it take so long? It was because the relationship after 1945 was really heavily disturbed. And when the discussion started in 1949, the wounds, they were very, very deep of the very violent period before that. The Dutch had a very bad relationship with Indonesia's President Sukarno. There was irritation on the Indonesian side about the holding of Papua by the Dutch. And again, there was Dutch irritation about the 1965 coup d'etat. Now, next slide, please. Yeah. From the start, restitution was on the agenda, always. Now, what did the two do? They had their roundtable conference in 1949, and the Netherlands was really nervous. We had a slogan in the Netherlands, in Dutch it said, India verloren, rampspoed geboren. It means if the Dutch Indies are lost, a disaster is born here. And you could see that because financially, Indonesia was extremely important for the Netherlands. And in the negotiations, the Netherlands had charged Indonesia with an enormous amount of debt as compensation for Dutch lost interest. It meant, in fact, that the political independence was not accompanied by full economic independence. And this created a lot of distrust at the Indonesian side. And in a way, they really wanted to cut the ties as quickly as possible. But during the roundtable conference, a subcommittee on cultural affairs was appointed. And they drafted a cultural agreement, and this cultural agreement had an article on restitution, but it never became effective, although the Indonesians later, they tried it, but they did not really succeed. So then, there were very, very hard years, as I was explaining, but after 1965, they had to come to an agreement. Next slide, please. And in the agreement, there was in 1968, there was a cultural agreement was reached, but it was not on objects, it was on archives. And the interesting thing was that if you look at it from the current perspective, at that time, the Dutch pushed for the principle of reciprocity. So they denied the inequality and the injustice of colonialism. And we look at that now, nowadays, we would never do that again. But, some archives would go back to Indonesia, and Indonesia would give some archives back to the Netherlands. And why was it important? Because many of, especially the Jogja archives, they contained information which was quite negative about the Dutch atrocities committed in those years, 1945, 1949. And at a certain moment, the two countries agreed, and they followed the official principle at first of the successor state. That means that the new state that comes out of the old state is entitled to have all the archives which are related to the administration of the colonial power and also of Japan, etc. But this created a big, big problem, because then, the shipment of archives is very expensive, and it's risky, because it's often these materials are fragile. So finally, pragmatism reigned, and it was agreed that archives which were in Indonesia would remain there, and archives which were in the Netherlands would remain in the Netherlands. And in the archival field, the cooperation always has been more or less fruitful. And it even feels that the discussion about archives helped as some sort of a warming up for the discussion about objects. Objects are more sensitive. And then in 1974, I just jump a bit through the history. In 1974, a secret Indonesian mission came to the Netherlands. It was quite interesting, because the Ministry of Foreign Affairs did not know about it. They had been invited by the municipality of Amsterdam, which usually is a bit more progressive than for instance, the foreign ministry. And this mission wanted to investigate what objects are there in Dutch public collections. So they visited several museums and institutions. They discussed many people. They made photographs of objects, and they copied documents, etc. And at the end of their trip, they had a list of 10,000 objects in Dutch public collections from Indonesia, which might be good if they were returned. And later on in 1975, when the official negotiations started, they were to be the basis for the Indonesian claim. And the foreign ministry in the Netherlands, they were really upset about it, because they felt they had not been informed about it, but they were much more worried about this long list of 10,000 objects. And they immediately ordered an investigation into what objects had come from Indonesia. And they discovered that high-ranking colonial officials, high-ranking military, entrepreneurs, business people, and so, who had been working in Indonesia, they had smuggled for their own collections objects out of Indonesia. Now, then we had, at that time, Indonesia had a very strong foreign minister, Adam Malik, you see him here. And we had a rather open-minded foreign minister, Max van der Stoel. And they were some sort of key players in the breakthrough that the two countries said, well, we have to come to an agreement and we have to do something. On this slide, you see also two heads from the Borobudur temple complex. The gray one, I'll come back to it later, is in the Rijksmuseum-Amsterdam. The brownish one is in the Tropenmuseum. And the Dutch government in the report, as I told you already, but I'm repeating it, they said that these Dutch officials, they had taken objects against the law, in fact. Then in 1975, you know, both countries had agreed upon that there would be, can I have the following, the next slide? You know, both countries had agreed upon that each of them should appoint a team of experts, and those two team of experts, they had to discuss recommendations of how to deal with future cultural relations. Now, the meeting took place in Jakarta. You know, the Indonesian, the chairman was Professor Mantra. He was the chair of the Indonesian team of experts. He was very polite. He was thanking the Dutch for taking care for so many centuries of Dutch Indonesian heritage and for the archival exchange and for a few returns that are taken back. And the Dutch, the chair of the Dutch team, Rob Hotke of the Ministry for Culture, he said that, you know, of course, things have to go back, but only a limited quantity, and especially quantities to fill the gaps in Indonesian collections. So this was already some sort of a disagreement. And in the end, you know, the Indonesian delegation, they stuck to the list of 10,000 objects, whereas the Dutch delegation said, no, we only want to do a few things. And then the breakthrough that was interesting was a visit to Indonesia's Minister for Education and Culture, Sharif Tayyip. And he said, yeah, but you know, if 10,000 objects come back, we do not know where to store them. We do not know what to do with them. And in the Indonesian team of experts, there was really disappointment. You know, they really felt disappointment because they thought we have been fighting to get those 10,000 objects back. And the Dutch delegation, they were behind their hands, they were smiling because they thought, well, they will accept our proposal. And that happened. So in 1975, they agreed to a number of joint recommendations, and both of the governments confirmed these recommendations later. And one of the points was that the Prasna Paramitra was returned to Indonesia, you know, which was, I think that was the biggest piece, the Mona Lisa of Asia, and still very popular. But I should add to that, that on the list of 10,000 objects, there were 4 very important Hindu heads of gods, Hindu gods, big shots. And Indonesia would have loved to get them back as well, but the Dutch had played it in such a way that they did not have to return 5 of these big statues, but only 1. But the 4, they were on the list. And I wonder whether they should be part of negotiations nowadays between the Netherlands and Indonesia again. So that was one thing. And then a number of treasures, you see them, of the Lombok treasure, they went back. And objects related to Prince Diponegoro, but also the Kris, but it never went back. And then also that's important, the Netherlands promised to help locate non-state possessors, so private possessors, for instance of Buddha heads from the Borobudur temple complex. And this never happened either. It is still in the Rijksmuseum. Now, I want to say a few words about the Kris of Diponegoro. Next slide, please. And, you know, the Kris, it has a history of popping up and disappearing all the time. And no one really knew how it looked like. And that is still playing nowadays. And no one knew where it was. And people were saying, maybe it's in Vienna. Maybe it's in the Rijksmuseum. Maybe it's in Leiden. Maybe it's in Indonesia. And the point was that all these museums, every now and then, they lost objects or objects were stolen. So it was really difficult. And twice a Dutch ambassador in Jakarta in 83 and 85 suggested that the Netherlands should give back the Kris to Indonesia because it was more important for them than for us. And in 1984, between those 2 years, the director of the Museum Volkenkunde in Leiden said, I think I found it. But it was not a Kris which went back in March 2020. And I know that in 1995, when the then Queen Beatrix was going to visit Indonesia, it was suggested that she would take the Kris of Diponegoro with her on her state visit. And then the museum in Leiden, they started to look for it. They said, we cannot find it. It's impossible to find it. Sorry. So, you know, it was always there. And outside researchers of the museum who tried to do research at that time, they were not really helped very much. But in 2017, the museum made a change. And according to their own words, it had to do with pressure from the media, from the academic world. It had to do with changing ethics inside the museum itself. And they started to look afresh at the provenance of the Kris and the history. And the good thing was that, you know, compared with earlier provenance research, they opened the windows, fresh air was coming in, new views were coming in, and they were also willing to consult experts from Indonesia. And I think that's very crucial if you want to do good provenance research. Now, in 2020, at the end of 2019, the Kris was found, and early in 2020, it went back to Indonesia. And here you see a very happy ambassador with our Minister for Culture and the director of the National Museum of World Cultures, where it was found. And in the argument of the minister, why she was giving it back, said, you know, it's an international agreement. Oh yeah, it's in compliance with an international agreement. That's what she said. In other words, it should have been done much earlier in 1975, but it lasted until 2020 before it went back. Imagine. Now, these same international agreements are there in relation, for instance, to Buddha heads from the Borobudur, but they're all still in the Netherlands, or for instance, to the skull cap of Java men, which is in Naturalis Biodiversity Center in Leiden. And the skull cap was also mentioned in the joint recommendations of 1975, but it never happened, you know, that really said, well, what should we do with it? Now, going to the end, can I have the next slide, please? Yep. You know, some lessons. Well, I could draw many lessons, but I think one thing which is very crucial is that the main issue in decolonization and in the whole restitution debate is the restoration of trust. And it is trust that European colonizers heavily violated, and it is therefore up to these European colonizers to take the first steps. Of course, if you have to restore trust, you have to do it from two sides. But, you know, the Europeans, they were the big violators. That's one thing. The second lesson is that, you know, we have to recognize the right of former colonies to their own cultural heritage. It is not up to us anymore. And that is also why, you know, former colonies should get the initiative in deciding about priorities in provenance research. You know, what dubiously acquired collections or objects are to be studied first? And former colonizers should facilitate this process. Then I think the last thing, it's almost a psychological lesson. But doing provenance research together, meaning between the global south and the global north, is essential for good object biographies, but it will also make it easier for former colonizers to let go prestigious objects. Thank you very much. Oh yeah. Can I do this one, Chair? Michel? You know, give me one chance. I'll keep it very short. There's often an interesting question in the Netherlands, and it's, you know, the people have visited the Museum Nacional in Jakarta. They're impressed by the large number of objects, a rich collection. And the Museum Nacional is the continuation of the Museum of the Batavian Society for Arts and Sciences. And if such a museum is so full, why then is it necessary that the Netherlands return a large number of objects? But I leave that for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Ya, oke. Thank you, well, Pak Yos. Terima kasih banyak. And let me address your question first before I translate it in bahasa Indonesia. And actually, we are happy here to welcoming many participants outside of Jakarta. So many people also here coming from Sumatra, from Jawa Timur, East Java, Central Java, and Kalimantan even. So maybe we can have a discussion later on. Oke, jadi kawan-kawan yang baik, seperti yang disampaikan oleh pembicara kedua, banyak sekali hal yang ya sekali lagi menyambung tadi dari yang pertama, Bu Evelien. Ini dengan judul dikemas dengan judul yang menarik, Long and Winding Road, seperti lagunya The Beatles. Jadi sejarahnya dibicarakan tadi bagaimana ternyata sudah pembicaraan terkait pengembalian ini sudah banyak dibahas gitu ya. Bahkan sejak pembicaraan terkait penyerahan kedaulatan di konferensi Meja Bundar. Di situ ada draft dari perjanjian kebudayaan sebenarnya. Ya kemudian seperti yang juga beririsan dengan riset saya sebenarnya kemudian itu tidak banyak akhirnya terabandon akhirnya banyak terlupakan sampai kemudian tahun 68 dimulai lagi adanya kesepakatan kebudayaan lagi di antara kedua negara antara Indonesia dan Belanda tidak mengarah atau tidak menyasar kepada objek dulu tapi kepada arsip. Nah pada tahun ini pengennya pihak Belanda itu pengennya harus ada resiprokal, jadi saling rasa saling sama-sama ketersalingan gitu ya, harus sama-sama mengeluarkan modal yang sama, harus sama-sama punya sumber daya yang sama, dan ini mengabaikan banyaknya ketidaksamaan gitu kan, dan juga ketidakadilan yang terjadi pada saat kolonialisme. Kemudian beberapa tahun kemudian tahun 74 ada misi dari Indonesia yang disebut sebagai misi rahasia gitu ya. Karena menarik sekali banyak pihak terlibat. Di antaranya Menteri Luar Negeri Adam Malik dengan Menteri Luar Negeri Belanda ketika itu Max van der Stoel gitu ya. Beberapa kali pertemuan sampai kemudian setahun berikutnya terjadilah pemulangan beberapa benda warisan budaya seperti arca yang untuk orang-orang publik Indonesia dikenal sebagai arca Kededes yang sebenarnya arca Prajna Paramita gitu kan. Dan dari situ sebenarnya sudah ada pendataan terkait berapa banyak sih barang-barang yang diambil dari luar terutama dari Indonesia. Ternyata dari list itu ada 10.000 objek gitu kan. Dan pada tahun 75 pihak Belanda juga berjanji untuk melakukan membantu dalam mencari beberapa koleksi-koleksi seperti misalnya patung arca kepala Buddha gitu ya dari kompleks Candi Borobudur. Kemudian yang menarik sebenarnya dan juga buat publik Indonesia hari ini misalnya masalah pengembalian keris gitu ya. Sampai tahun 2017 sebenarnya sudah ada banyak pihak untuk meminta pengembalian pusaka-pusaka Diponegoro, terutama ke pihak Belanda ya. Bahkan di Belanda sendiri banyak sekali pihak yang meminta agar museum lebih banyak melibatkan peneliti di luar institusi museum, seperti misalnya Pak Yos sendiri dan Profesor Susan Hen dari Amsterdam. Sampai kemudian tahun 2017 pihak museum memutuskan untuk membuka lagi penelitian terhadap keris Diponegoro sampai 2,5 tahun kemudian ditemukanlah keris yang diduga Diponegoro itu yang ternyata ada di bagian gudang bawah tanahnya milik museum. Nah, sebenarnya masih ada banyak koleksi-koleksi berharga lainnya yang jadi pertanyaan, misalnya seperti tadi arca kepala Buddha di Rijksmuseum Amsterdam dan juga yang sempat saya tanyakan waktu beberapa kali itu terkait ada satu museum besar, Natural History Museum Naturalis Biodiversity Center, itu ada kepala manusia Jawa, tulang tengkoraknya manusia Jawa. Terakhir terkait pelajaran-pelajaran apa, ada 4 pelajaran yang bisa diambil dari masalah ini, bahwa isu utama menurut Pak Yos dekolonisasi adalah restorasi dari trust gitu ya, atau saling kepercayaan antara bekas penjajah dengan yang bekas dijajahnya gitu kan. Dan bekas penjajah harus mengakui gitu ya hak dari bekas jajahannya terhadap warisan budaya mereka. Kemudian si pihak yang penjajah tadi, mantan penjajah tadi itu, si mantan gitu ya, harus memberikan inisiatif untuk menentukan prioritas-prioritas, khususnya riset-riset yang terkait riset sumber atau asal dari mana, provenance research, itu kepada pihak negara yang bekas dijajah. Kemudian juga yang terakhir dan yang harus dilakukan adalah sama-sama melakukan riset bersama ini loh. Ini adalah satu hal yang paling penting, yang esensial untuk mendapatkan bagaimana sih objek biografi dari suatu objek tersebut yang komplit gitu. Dan dari situ dengan adanya sama-sama kayak gini, maka ini akan juga memberikan peluang bagi kerjasama lebih lanjut dan memberikan apresiasi, memudahkan terutama pihak bekas penjajah untuk menyerahkan kembali barang-barang yang dinilai sebagai warisan berharga. Pertanyaan terakhir oleh Pak Yos untuk kita bahas bersama, kalau ini nanti kalau misalnya dipulangkan gitu kan, apa harus ke Museum Nasional? Sedangkan Museum Nasional sendiri merupakan museum yang kelanjutan dari institusi yang besar sekali yang sudah ada sejak 200 tahun yang lalu, yang bernama Batavia Genotschap van Kunst en Elodenschappen. Nah, apa itu harus dipulangkan? Sedangkan mereka sudah sangat banyak sekali koleksi. Apa harus di sana atau harus kemana? Nah, untuk itu kita nanti bisa tanya setelah pembicaraan terakhir. Michael, the floor is yours again.
Okay, well, we have been hearing about history, about in 1815, they already started talking about this subject. It had been under attention in Vienna. It was actually at the same time, the stealing really got started in 1815 after that. So it's a very nice coincidence. And we heard about Mr. van Beurden about the more recent history and about the irritations, about the unease, especially on the Dutch side, where they didn't want to give things back and they started bargaining about artifacts instead of really talking about history and historical values. But the positive thing I take away from that is that apparently thinking over the last few years has evolved quickly and hugely, and that's both Evelien Campfens and Jos van Beurden who talk about that. And the fact that we are sitting here is already a proof of that. There is movement finally, and there is a discussion about the essential part of giving back a country, not only artifacts, but its history. And well, that brings me to the next speaker, which is Sri Margana, who is a lecturer from UGM, University-Yogyakarta Mada in Jogja, and also the lecturer, the Van Leur Chair in Leiden. And you will give us the Indonesian perspective on all this. And I'm really anxious to hear that after what we heard so far.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Good evening, everybody in Indonesia, and also good afternoon, colleague in the Netherlands. Today, I would like to talk about the issues about the restitution of the colonial object from Indonesian perspective. It is I was involved since the last few months when the issue coming up in Indonesia. And then I was also requested to be part of the board or committee that will handle this restitution plan. So can you go to the next slide, please? Next slide. Yes. First, I would like to start to the responding to the idea of the restitution of the colonial object. Yeah, we thought that this is it shows a kind of a goodwill from the government of the Netherlands, of awareness of justice, and awareness of the history, and awareness of the future of relationship between Indonesia and also in the Netherlands. So we are welcome all the ideas, and then also we think that the right this is the right of any nation to take their heritage back home, especially those heritage that has been taken by the colonial government during the colonial period, and as an independent nation, we have the rights to get back our heritage. And for Indonesia, this is also kind of momentum. We have to admit that we realize that especially me, who has been several years in the Netherlands, I know exactly how the government of the Netherlands and the museum institution in the Netherlands has spending a lot of money and also efforts to preserve the heritage that they taken from Indonesia, and they treat it really well and very good. So and then if then we compare to what happened in Indonesia, and from then until now, that there are still a lot of problems and that we face in the in organizing the museum, and there's still a lot of issue in many aspects. So this is kind of a momentum for in Indonesian institution to really rethinking about the museum, reorganizing the museum, how to manage the museum better in the future. And of course, this we are also happy for this idea because of the our desire for the new knowledge production, because the absence or the unavailability of artifact that is now displaced in the Netherlands has also made us the way we telling our history for something sometimes discontinued because of unavailable object and artifact. So, and there's a lot of mystery also in our history that need to be explained more to our generation, and that's why the idea of restitution should also bring a kind of new knowledge production. Next. But we realized that a lot of problems, that it's not an easy job to to return all this colonial subject, especially if we counted for that the amount of object that now available in the Netherlands that they will be returned to Indonesia. There's a lot amount of object. Jos in the early presentation mentioned about there's already an early list of 10,000 objects. You can imagine this is a lot of objects. So this will also cause a lot of problems, especially about the safety and the security of the object from the transportation of the object from the Netherlands to Indonesia, and also security of the preservation of the object when they arrive in Indonesia. It's a really big issue that really have to address when the plan of the restitution take place. And then we also have to consider the cost of the restitution. There should be a discussion about this. Who will be responsible for the cost of the restitution? Whether it's the Netherlands who has taken the object, or Indonesian sites that will receive the object. So this is really not an easy discussion to discuss, especially because of considering the amount of objects that so many, and then also the distance between Indonesia and the Netherlands. And this is not an easy issue that have to be discussed also. And then, of course, we also have to touch about the human resources. I mean, not all of the objects in the Netherlands that taken to the Netherlands and is something that what do you call it? Foreign for Indonesian expertise. Some of them we are already accustomed with that kind of object, but of course not every institution, every museum in Indonesia has the same level of expertise. So we still lack of human resources who are expert on preserving this object, and also the institution that support this in developing this human resource. So it will touch the issue about the people that will taking care all those objects when they back to Indonesia. And other issues also, the problems is the place, also the location. Earlier, Jos asking about whether it's all will be written to the National Museum of Jakarta or whether to other places, other institutions. So this is also an issue that we have to deal with. Institution, equipment, technology, and all very much related to each other when the object is coming back to Indonesia. And of course, like what we have mentioned, if the earlier presenter talking about the legal aspect of the restitution, but we also have to deal with, we are as a reserver, we have to deal with the problems of property or ownership that will lead to the legal conflict, because people will asking, no, this particular object is coming from Solo or from Malang or from Surabaya or from Banjarmasin, so they have to be returned to Banjarmasin, for instance. So it's kind of problem of property is also a big issue. If we don't touch really on that issue, that will also cause a problem. And that's why it is then very important for Indonesia also to really issue the law and regulation that will be the base of preserving and organizing all the returns object. Next. Okay, and then what is the Indonesian plan? When the issue is coming up in this year, especially, and then especially after the return of the Christopher Goron, then we consider to think larger, broader about the possibility of returning other objects, especially when we were visiting Leiden Museum at that time. The issue has already been brought about by the director of the museum about the possibility of bringing many more objects from the Netherlands to Indonesia. That's why we have to respond it with establishing a kind of a special committee that will organize, that will handling the restitution project. And we have already decided, and we have already a kind of board under the direction of the Director General of Culture, Dr. Hilmar Farid in this case. And then which is consists of many personal also professional, like historian, archaeologists, and anthropologists, philologists, lawyers, diplomats, and also journalists. So this is very mixed board that, but perhaps because we're going to touch a lot of issues in this, as I mentioned before, So we have to involve so many expertise in this committee. We still have to wait for the agreement from the Minister of Education about the committee and the way our committee will work. Next. Okay, and then we decided that to at least to avoid all this kind of problem, we have to prepare with the only good way to handle all this problem or to anticipate the problem is if we have to do kind of provenance research, like what Jos has mentioned before, how important it is provenance research, because this will clarify the origin of the object. That's also the property of the objects, and this is also important to really locate the geography of the object, and this is also then important by government to decide whether this object will be returned to the original stored in the National Museum in Jakarta. And provenance research is also important to the value, whether it's religious, whether it's cultural, whether it's historical. It is important that to identify which one is much more precious than other, which is this important to make a kind of priority in returning the object, because we could not bring all together without any considering the value of each object. And then the last was also it is important that it is not we just receiving back the object without any others outcomes. So what we expect is that the return object should be accompanied with the knowledge production. So about the role and the function of the object, measuring the knowledge development, and it's very important in this case. So that's why next we have different plans in preparing this. Also, we will give a kind of grant for research and study that will providing the heritage studies and research grant for master and PhD in history, archaeology, anthropology, museology, and other relevant subjects that would support this and would support the idea when preservation when the object coming back to Indonesia. And of course, this is also another issue that already mentioned by Jos. Collaboration with universities, museum, and research institute between Europe and Indonesia. It's very important. So all this kind of issue that we are aware of that problems that, and we also aware that this is not a very short-term project. This is really long-term. Should be done gradually, and then should be accompanied with with other works, like developing infrastructure of the museum, building restoration, security, improving the security standard, and developing human resources, expertise, particular side, and of course the promotion, how to make use and to make benefit for all this written subject. That's what I can say for this moment. Thank you.
Oke, baik. Terima kasih Pak Margana. Ini luar biasa sekali. Kita bisa dapat informasi langsung setelah dari pihak Belanda gitu kan. Ini dari pihak Indonesia, dan Pak Margana sendiri juga terlibat dalam tim atau komite yang dibentuk oleh Kementerian Pendidikan dan Kebudayaan terkait restitusi ini tadi. Ada beberapa poin yang bisa kita diskusikan tadi yang disampaikan oleh pembicara terakhir kita. bahwa terkait ide restitusi objek kolonial ini menunjukkan bahwa adanya goodwill dari pemerintah negeri Belanda khususnya untuk mengakui bahwa ada hak dari setiap bangsa untuk membawa pulang istilahnya warisan budayanya. Dan juga ini adalah momentum menurut Pak Margana dari pihak Indonesia untuk melakukan semacam suatu reorganisasi dari museum yang ada di Indonesia. Dan ini juga kesempatan bersama untuk melakukan produksi pengetahuan baru. Akan tetapi Pak Margana juga mengingatkan bahwa ada masalah-masalah ya seperti yang kita ketahui di Indonesia terkait yang pertama masalah keamanan, kemudian dari si objek budaya itu sendiri, keamanan yang dimaksud mulai dari transport kalau memang itu dikembalikan sampai kemudian pelestariannya di suatu museum tertentu. Bukan hal yang baru, tadi seperti disampaikan ya itu apa namanya bahwa keamanan museum juga masih menyisakan masalah. Kemudian juga anggaran atau biaya dari pemulangan itu juga. Kemudian ada masalah sumber daya manusia, tempatnya seperti tadi yang sudah dibahas dua pembicara sebelumnya. Apakah harus di Jakarta semua, apakah harus di Museum Nasional gitu kan? Kalau memang di daerah bagaimana infrastrukturnya? Kemudian juga tadi seperti yang disampaikan oleh Bu Evelien masih ada permasalahan-permasalahan hukum yang harus diselesaikan. Oleh karena itu di dalam tim yang dibentuk oleh Kementerian Pendidikan dan Kebudayaan tidak hanya ahli sejarah, tidak hanya ahli arkeologi, tidak hanya ahli filologi, tapi juga ada ahli hukum di situ. Dan nantinya akan disiapkan juga regulasi atau hukum atau peraturan pemerintah yang menunjang ke arah restitusi. Kemudian terkait produksi pengetahuan bersama, bahwa provenance research itu adalah kunci, gitu, kalau bisa dibilang, atau penelitian tentang sumber. Kenapa? Karena pengembalian suatu objek budaya harus ya ini melalui riset-riset provenance, khususnya terkait objek-objek kebudayaan yang atau warisan-warisan budaya yang tidak terdapat dokumen-dokumen yang lengkap atau dokumen tertulis yang lengkap. Kemudian juga penelitian model ini penting karena untuk mengidentifikasi sumbernya tentang objek itu sendiri dan bagaimana perjalanan si objek itu, bagaimana dari mana dia berasal, siapakah pemilik aslinya, bagaimana dia keliling dunia sebelum sampai ke tempat terakhir terletak dan oleh siapa, kemudian tujuannya apa, dan dari situ kita bisa tahu nilai-nilai yang ada di situ. Nah, untuk menunjang hal itu, Pak Margana menyampaikan bahwa hal ini merupakan proses yang panjang, oleh karena itu dalam membentuk sumber daya manusia, gitu kan, itu pihak pemerintah akan mengusahakan menyediakan grant atau dana penelitian khusus untuk heritage studies di tingkat di jenjang master maupun PhD. Wah, sayang sekali saya sudah terlanjur PhD, seharusnya bisa apply nanti. Dan yang tak kalah pentingnya juga bagaimana kolaborasi perlu dilakukan oleh perguruan tinggi, lembaga-lembaga riset maupun museum-museum yang ada di Eropa maupun di Indonesia. Terkait masalah reorganisasi museum, Pak Margana menyampaikan bahwa perlu sekali yaitu sekali lagi infrastruktur diperhatikan selain sumber daya manusia. Infrastruktur bagaimana di daerah itu juga bisa memanfaatkan maupun menyimpan koleksi-koleksi apabila memang nanti benda-benda itu akan dikembalikan ke daerah asalnya. Oke, saya pikir demikian. The floor is yours, Pak Michael.
Okay. To start the discussion, first I want to ask Mr. Sri Margana, because he mentioned a lot of problems, a lot of points that have to be addressed, like infrastructure, museums, study. It's like you have to start all over again doing history, and Netherlands have to start giving you everything and every access. But also, do you expect the Netherlands to give you also the help in changing the infrastructure, in improving the museums, in teaching museum staff and historians, and give you all the access for study?
Yes, I think it's true, Michael, because when they taken most of the object some of them accompanied with the document, with the archive, and then all this document and the archive is available in the Netherlands. So that will be the source, important source for the study from the provenance research also. And also because the availability of the long availability of the object in the Netherlands has also producing a lot of research done by Dutch expertise on that field, on that object as well. That's why we have to admit that most of the expert on this is also owned by the Netherlands government. So that's why the collaboration, the assistance from the Dutch government, whether it's from the historical institution, universities, and research institution, is very important. Yeah, to be more accustomed with this, the way how to handle this object properly when they coming back to Indonesia.
Yeah, and is it like you are almost redoing history, because during Suharto time, history has become very solid. There was no way of telling another history than the one that Suharto approved of, and that history almost didn't go back any further than 1945, and all the artifacts that are in colonial possession, possession in the museums. Those are, most of them are from even before colonial times. Will that bring you to a review of the entire written history in Indonesia?
I think so. It is something that a lot of new things that will come up when, for instance, 10,000 objects. If we could do object to do provenance research for the several objects, how many new knowledge that we could find from this. So it's kind of a new building a history for Indonesia that so far we could not do because we do not have the document, the archive, we do not the artifact, we don't have all those supporting resources and artifact that will be studied. So this is really perhaps this can also change the history of Indonesia in the past. Historiography can really change when most of the objects are coming back to Indonesia. And what we have what we saw in already seen in the Netherlands, the object is coming from different periods, from the Hindu period, from the war period, from different period of history of Indonesia. So that's why the gaps that so far we haven't finds the gap that we find in our historiography can be filled by the return of the object. And I imagine that there are a lot of precious objects that also become the key of the question that could answer the key questions that raised in the Indonesian historiography. In so many historical conference from since 1957 until now, there's a lot of questions that cannot be answered because of the unavailability of the artifact and also the document and archive. So, and I think it's true. There's really kind of rebuilding a historiography for Indonesia.
And then I have a question for Jos van Beurden, because you ended your talk with a question about the National Museum, and I sensed a sense of skepticism, as if you wanted to say that they already have enough in that museum, they don't need any more. But I think you meant it otherwise. Maybe you have something to add to that.
Yeah, well, I was curious what people think about it in the audience, actually. But my own view is that I think it's not a reason not to return. It's Indonesia's cultural heritage, and it's up to them, to decide what happens with it. So for me, but I know the argument is sometimes mentioned in the Netherlands, And I know that during the Roundtable Conference in 1949, one of the ministers used this argument to say, you know, we will give back some war booty, and that's enough. Now, I disagree with him. I think we're living now in the 21st century, and we look differently at those things.
I have a question for you from Mr. Paul Verhoeven. He wants to know more about this wish list of 10,000 objects. He asks if you have a copy of that.
I do not have a copy of it. And I guess it's in the Archives Nationales, but it is mentioned in many of the archival materials that the Indonesians had this list.
Don't you think it would be better to make a new list now instead of relying on the old one?
That's not up to me. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, that's what Indonesia should do.
Because, well, maybe that's the thinking about this whole issue has changed so much in the past decades that it should have a total new beginning. It's like we could see something of that the other day, when in Egypt there was a huge procession of mummies who were moved from one museum to another, and maybe that's there was a question for Evelien that about human remains. Well, the procession showed a lot of national interest in artifacts, in mummies, in history. But the question is, are we able to declare ownership of human remains just simply because of their value as educational materials? So I think that's why the mummies were kept in museums in France and England. It's just, can we do that?
Well, that's a very interesting point, because actually I also studied, I just want to mention a case which was in court here 2 years ago about a stolen Buddha statue from China, which had a mummy inside. So now we're not talking about colonial looting or anything. Anyhow, that statue was acquired by a Dutch collector in Hong Kong, which is a famous hub for, well, anyhow, there was no questions asked about the provenance, and it was discovered, and it came to a court case between the Chinese communities wanting it back and the Dutch collector and the Dutch court, and the Dutch collector said, well, you know, it was just 20 years ago, and the limitation, it's my artifact, I bought it for a lot of money, and it's my property. And actually that's the case. If you approach this, so the question again is, do you see what we see in some places as an artifact that you can own, property, possession under property law, another person sees as you know, holy to you, and you cannot own. Normally, I would say you cannot own human remains. Mummies, I mean, mummies, now you're talking about, you know, that's normally in all kind of ethical rules. Normally, human remains are a separate category in all kinds of ethical rules. For example, the ICOM, the International Code of Museum Practice, also has very special rules for that. And most of the times, Dutch or national governments in countries, there are special rules. Just so, my main answer, I guess, would be, can you declare ownership because of scientific reason? No, I don't think just like that. It depends, then again, on what kind of human remains there are. I know that, you know, for mummies, let's say the British Museum is making an exception at 1,000 years, let's say. But normally, according to the rules, for example, this UNDRIP that I mentioned, you have to, there is a right of return, repatriation, not of ownership, but repatriation by the indigenous communities. And you cannot just say, I think, as a museum, I own them. You can say this, but I think also as a community, then you could make a claim, or you can say, well, this cannot just be owned. But I'm not sure if I help the question here.
It's not easy. That's clear now.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, but no, it's very insightful, because what we learn of this is that it's really, really complicated. In every case, whichever you take. And there's one question for Margana, and we touched the subject already. That is, if thousands of objects have to be returned, to whom will they have to be returned? Can you return it to the family of owners, or the tribe, or the government, or who is the first you want to deal with?
I think they should be returned to the government, because if you return to the original ownership, then it's become chaotic, because there's a lot of claim. Lately, there's already issues about that. How when the diamond from the Banjarmasin was coming up in public, and then suddenly there's already a kind of claim from a family or individual who said that he's the most people who had the right to own the object. So and it's thousands of objects. So if we return back to the original owners, then it will become chaotic. So this should become the like the poverty of the nation. And then I myself suggested they should not only be placed in the National Museum, they have to be written in the regional museum. For instance, if the provenance can prove that a certain object originated from Malang, for instance, it will be a good idea if the object returned to the museum in East Java, for instance. So then it's become, because this kind of artifact also relate with the local identity, which is part of the national identity as a whole. So if the local people, society in the area receive back their cultural object, they could digging more their identity, and that become what the kind of proudness of the people in that location. So I think this is what we have to do, and I think as you see in the museum in Jakarta, the space is very limited, and the way they, did the object is difficult to get very nice display because of the limited of the object, and then most of the objects are stored in the warehouse that's not easily controlled, the security, the safety of the object. So I think it's a good idea to share the object to other regions.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions about infrastructure and so, but there's one question from Jos van Beurden at the moment. He wants to ask something.
Yeah, I would like to make two remarks. One is, it strikes me that in the Special Restitution Committee you were talking about, there are no representatives from the old sultanates. They're just professionals. That's one remark. And the second remark is that the issue of friction between the national level and, say, regional level, sultanates, etc., is not purely Indonesian. You see the same, Evelien mentioned the example of the Benin objects in Nigeria. And there you also see the friction between the federal government, the state government, where this Benin court is established, and the old Benin royal house. And they have to solve it. And my question to you is, would it be thinkable that Indonesia organizes a new Bandung conference to discuss precisely this issue of how to deal between the national level and say regional level, local princes, etc., because it's worldwide. And we as former colonies cannot take the initiatives. It's not our role anymore, but there is a big need. You see the same in South America. You see the same in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They're all quarreling with this. What do you do between the national and the local level or the regional level?
May I directly answer the questions?
Yes, please.
Yeah, yes, Jos. I think we are also talk about it because there are more than 100 sultanate now that still, culturally still try to preserve their ancestor legacy, and it's not an easy issue. It's not an easy to do with this sultanate, but we will bring this issue by with a kind of public, what you call it, inviting public opinion in a workshop or conference about this, that will also involving there are representatives from the sultanate, and this is also that the one of the big problem that we're going to face when all the colonial objects return to Indonesia, because there will be a lot of claims, there are a lot of demand, a lot of persecution on this object. This is not easy. That's why I in this presentation I said that we still have to deal with a lot of problems, including this one. If we could not deal with this issue perfectly or in a good way, then it brings kind of chaotic problem, something like that. So I think it's a good idea to have a kind of conference, like a big conference that will involving, because this is also to address the question that I saw in the chat room, and that this is not only a problem of Indonesia and the Netherlands. Now it's become a kind of a global problem with the colonized country and the colonized country. So that's why this has become a common issue that we can bring together. So the idea of kind of Asian African conference like we had in Bandung in 1950s, we can do that, and to address, to get a common agreement between the colonized country, at least to give the right attitude to the idea of restitution.
This is a bit of uncharted territory. There are no examples of countries who are doing the right thing, the right way, and do it quickly and just. But so we have to invent everything ourselves. Is that a bit the case now?
Yeah, this is also, that's why I more agree like what Evelien have presented in the first presentation. What kind of law or regulation that applied for this restitution? For me, this should be relate to the more global law or regulation, like human rights law, for instance, because this is not dealing. This is not only between the colonized and colonized country, but this really involving so many actors. If you're looking at the provenance research, that most of the object perhaps they done by the government, but there's also private actors that have a role in bringing all this colonial object to the for instance to the Netherlands or to England, which is they're not can be considered as a state, but they are private. So that's why this cannot be applied only based on the law or regulation that dealing with between the two countries, but it's should be more general law that apply for everybody.
And maybe Evelien can say something about that, because you have been also working for years retrieving stolen goods by the Nazis, and that's a case that's still going on. And that also involves states, but also individuals and families. And so is there any, can you say that there's similarity between what we are discussing now and what you've been working on before?
Yeah, there are many similarities, I think, but what I just heard also reminds me of the system with Nazi-looted art in directly after the Second World War. Actually, I think going back, you have two systems. You have the interstate restitution system, and you have the human rights system, where today's restitution claims in the field of Nazi-looted art are claims by direct descendants. It couldn't be anymore an interstate model, because can you imagine? I mean, the families are not living anymore in the place they were once, where they lost their work. So, but it reminds me of the period in the post-war time, where all the works that were collected in Germany and Austria that were amassed by Hitler and Goering were sent back to their countries of origin. So in that way, for example, in the Netherlands, but in all kind of European countries, we got thousands of works back that came from the territory of the Netherlands. And then all these countries were forced by the Allies, let's say, to make special restitution laws that were based, actually, you can see them as human rights laws, where people that were deprived of these works under certain circumstances against the dictates of morality, let's say, because it could have been lawful, but under force, could claim it back. Now that's, I mean, it was for a very short time. And then in the end of the 90s, it came back. And now we have the system that, again, it's directly, you go as a victim or as a family, you go directly to a museum. You don't do that through a state. So maybe this is a kind of parallel.
And the other parallel is it took 75 years so far. And what we are talking now about what has to happen in Indonesia and in the Netherlands, I think that's going to take maybe even more than 75 years.
Yeah, well, maybe I just should add that there was a period between the 50s and 2000, let's say, that nothing much has happened also in the field of Nazi-looted art. So, but yeah, I mean, in 1998, when it started with the Nazi-looted art, everybody thought, okay, these are like 10 cases. And 20 years later, it's still going on, and there's still not a good legal model for that, I think. So I think there are many lessons to be learned from that.
I have here a question from Marije Plomp, and she says, we should temper the high expectations about provenance research. She works at the Leiden University Library, and what she sees there is that there's very little information, or none at all, about for instance, manuscripts that are kept in that library. So it's going to be a long search to get it all above the table. So Sri Margana, what are you expecting from that? He disappeared from my screen. So maybe Jos van Beurden can, oh, okay.
Sorry, lost connection. Can you repeat the questions?
Yeah, about it takes a long time, and there was one question here that even that's from a person, Marije Plomp, who works at the University Library in Leiden. And her experience is that there's very little information, or none at all, about, for instance, manuscripts that are kept in the library. So if you are looking for provenance information about all these artifacts, you should be careful about talking about that, because it can take years just to really find anything.
Yeah, that's true. Especially those objects that not accompanied with a clear document and good archive. This is also a problem that we have to face. To deal with this, we have to make a kind of a special agreement to this kind of object. I mean, if we could not find any proof of evidence about the document, it doesn't mean that they could not be written. It doesn't mean they not an object that part of the restitution object. So we really have to make a special agreement to this kind of object that's really difficult to find the evidence.
Well, I see here there's a good suggestion of by Daddy and Dato that the best way for manuscripts is to digitalize them and publish them. So that's what's already happening. So it won't even be necessary to get all the archives from the Netherlands to Indonesia if you can just give them a link and they can find it there.
I agree.
This is also one of the solutions that I also agree.
Yeah, I agree to a certain extent, because certain manuscripts, they have such an historical value that they should go back to the country of origin. You know, going to South America and going to what the Spanish conquistadores did, they took many of these very precious codices to Europe, where they got European names. Now, those should go back to Latin America. And the same, for instance, there was one manuscript, the Nagarakta Kama, sorry for my pronunciation, and it went back to Indonesia because it was important for Indonesia. That's different, for instance, from military reports or other things. They can be digitalized, but you have to make an exception for these historical important documents.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's another, it could make, documents could be made accessible for everybody. And it also happens, I know that. So that's a good thing. About your suggestion to involve the sultanates and the sultans, I have experience. They have meetings every now and then, all the kings and sultans of Indonesia, which is a couple of 200 or more. And it's a very mixed bunch. Not all of them are proven sultans or kings. There are a lot of claims, as Sri Margana already said. And well, you don't know what you end up with. There was this sultan, so-called Sultan of Banjarmasin. Maybe he is a relative, long-distant relative of the real sultan from 200 years ago. And he once had diamond, that is now very famous. Of course, he wants a diamond, but the Sultan of Yogyakarta, who is a very well-known and still powerful man, he claimed like 57,000 tons of gold from the English that apparently, according to him, was stolen from his palace. And so the claims will just flood all over you if you start talking with sultans. They want everything. So it's very difficult. That's why I asked the question, because I talked to historians in Indonesia, and I think I was told that the historians who talked to the committee in the Netherlands, that they explicitly said, don't give anything back to relatives. Just give everything back to the state and let them figure it out. And I think that's a good way to approach it, even with all the doubts you may have about the state of Indonesia and the government and everything, but that's clear. Don't you think so, Sri Margana?
I think they can make a kind of claim, even a really, really big claim, how many tons of gold they have, but they should also prove that what they said. I mean, they have to provide an evidence that what they said as well. If they could not prove the evidence about their claim, then we could not consider that. That's as simple as that.
Yeah, it's as simple as that. But if you involve them in the process, then it becomes another story. Then they will have to prove their claims, but then they have also a podium where they can drop all their claims and see what comes out of it. And yeah. I don't think it will speed up the process. It will make it more...
yeah. That's true. That's why in my last suggestion that it is important to issue a kind of regulation and law before this is implemented. That will prefer for Indonesian internal Indonesian problem.
Here's a suggestion of Mike Derksen. Why not make use of replicas? Who wants to say something about that? Maybe Jos van Beurden? Just put replicas everywhere.
No, bullshit. Oh, sorry, I should say it more polite. It does not help. It's not the essence of the thing. The essence of the thing is that a relationship has been violated, trust has been violated, and trust has to be restored. And you do not do that by sending replica unless the country of origin explicitly and in all freedom agrees with it. But it is no solution.
Yeah, I agree. That's not solution at all.
It's an insult.
It's an insult, yeah, because the conclusion of all your talks was more or less that that the two countries, and especially the Netherlands, have to rethink whatever they have been doing, have to rethink why all these artifacts are in the Netherlands and not in Indonesia. And the answer to that question is very clear and very painful for many people, is that because we stole them and we have to bring them back. And I think
no, we do not have to bring them back. You know, we should ask Indonesia to indicate priorities in what should go first. Yeah. And the experience in most of the processes of restitution is, it is never a claim all process. It's always, you know, we would like to get this collection or that collection or that object or that object. So that fear is unfounded.
Yeah.
Do you agree, Margana?
Hello?
Yep.
My voice still hurt?
Yeah. Yeah.
I just lost a while. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's why since the beginning that I address a lot of issues that we have to address first before all this can be implemented. And it's not easy. That's not easy. And but the biggest problem for me is not, the sensitivity of the issue is not only touching about the status of the object in the Netherlands, in the colonized country, but also the problem in the for the colonized country, because we know that if we're looking at the history when the Dutch where Indonesia was still colonized by the Dutch, not every society in Indonesia you know, against the colonialism. Some of them become the partner of the colonial government. Many sultanates which is pro-colonial, there are a lot of many of them. So there's a lot of debate also about that. This is proven when the Dutch were tried to coming back after the 1945. A lot of sultanate want to join back with the Netherlands Indians government. And only a few of them, people in Central Java and Yogyakarta, want to resist the return of the colonialism. This is also an issue that if we touch to this issue, that's become more problematic. So that's why why this issue should be bring up, because we have to agree in one point that now we have a nation. We're part of the nation state Indonesia, that we have to give all the, to the government to negotiate with and to deal with this plant, and we can do it further, and we could also address further the issue after the return. That become a problem. So that's why while we are doing dealing with how all those objects be returned to Indonesia, at the same time we have to do something internally to deal with all this kind of issue.
I have a question from Mr. Hans van de Bunte. He wants to. I'm sorry, I missed that. I didn't see it until now.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah,
Hi, thank you for the interesting talk and all the different views and opinions. I've been working for the Sarwak Museum in the last 6 years, which is in Sarawak, Borneo, Malaysia. But of course, because it is on Borneo, it is as much part of Nusantara as Indonesia is. And I would like to share some of my expertise with you, especially in the repatriation and the return of artifacts. I assisted in returning 3 different collections of objects: human remains, animal remains from Naturalis, human remains from Las Vegas, and a collection of ethnographic objects from Nusantara Museum in Delft. And they all came back to the Sarwak Museum. I believe, especially for Indonesia, it's important that all the different islands have a say in repatriation of the objects to that same island. So please not everything back to the National Museum in Jakarta. But I think Jos has a very good suggestion in having a Bandung conference on how to distribute internally collections back. Otherwise, Borneo would have never been able to get these 412 objects from Borneo. But on the other side, the practical way of doing it, I have had the experience of keeping it out of the law side. That is the easiest way. It is about trust. It is about being in contact with each other. And it is about understanding each other's points of view and priorities. If the law gets involved, I think it will take decades. If you can do it on a base of mutual trust, you can either repatriate or you can at least start with the provenance research. From the objects I have been assisted to bring back to Borneo, most of the provenance research is in Dutch, unfortunately, but true, and is not very helpful when you are in Indonesia, you speak Bahasa. So the provenance, but on the other side, as soon as my colleagues, the curators in the Sarwak Museum, saw the objects, they immediately knew what it was. So they could actually describe the provenance itself, almost up to the small region in Borneo itself, almost up to whether it was pre-19th century, pre-20th century, etc., etc. So I have found very much the trust in the Indonesian researchers themselves, in local people, in local communities, who can very much help with the research and the provenance of the object itself, as soon as it is back in the museum or in the storage or wherever. I do believe you need good storages, but there is multiple companies anywhere or colleagues available who can help with preparing those storages, assisting in building new storages or new museums, etc. That is not a problem anymore. I've been working there for 6 years on building a new museum, the Sarwak Museum complex, and we had a lot of help, for instance, simply from Indonesia, from places in Indonesia and also from Singapore. So even there, you do not really need to reach out to Western countries anymore. There is a lot of knowledge available in the country itself. And I believe for the next decade, I hope you all start studying archaeology, history, ethnography, biology, and you will be able to study the objects yourself.
Okay, I can conclude to this that the most important sentence we got was from Jos van Beurden, who just left his room, but he said, "It's not up to us." And I think that's the conclusion you can draw from everything that's happening at the moment. And I think that there was talk about a wish list of 10,000 artifacts. I think that Indonesia is at the point that it has to make a wish list, which is a lot bigger than that, which just doesn't only mention artifacts, but also all the things that that you have mentioned here, that Sri Margana mentioned, that people will have to study in the Netherlands, need help with infrastructure, need help with in the museums need help with everything, and to restart the study of history of Indonesia and to make Indonesia ready to receive all these artifacts and the stories that go with it, because they are much more important or of the same importance as the artifacts themselves. So there's a lot of work to do for Sri Margana and for the Indonesian historians. So maybe you can give a final word about all this, about all we talked about here.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's I think if we think about what we have done so far between Indonesia and the Netherlands, especially dealing with the cultural relationship, education relationship, actually part of the process that have started from a long time ago, and we could continue with that. And we just could not deny that all this kind of matter, especially about Indonesian history, about the Indonesian culture, we need to collaborate with the Netherlands. And then if in the development, we have accompanied with the issue to return all the objects that we studied there, which just belong to Indonesia. That's a kind of, for me, it's a kind of bonus. For me, the problem of the producing knowledge production is more important than the return of the object themselves. It doesn't really matter what it's but more important is how all kind of objects bring a new knowledge, new knowledge production for our nation. And then the problem of the way how we place it, how to transport it, is for me it's very easy, a technical issue that can be discussed gradually. What is important thing, how much when the object is written brings something valuable for Indonesia. What kind of value that we could take from this issue. And for me, this is a kind of, for us who already, especially Indonesia, that I aware already established a long relationship with the Netherlands in this kind of field. It's something that business as usual that we have to improve in the future. For me, like, yeah.
Thank you. And Evelien, is there anything you want to say about that? Final last words.
Final last words. Well, there was a lot also about these replicas and databases and provenance research. And well, I think that also those kind of solutions should be a very important part of the discussion. And also in the field of Nazi-looted art, this in the end turned out very important. Provenance, telling the story that needs to be told. That's a matter of recognition, and it should not only be about return of ownership.
Thank you.
My famous last words.
Yeah, okay. And Jos van Beurden.
Well, a few things. One is, do not overestimate the knowledge in the Netherlands, and do not underestimate the knowledge you have in Indonesia. There is much more, and you will discover it in the process. That's one. The second is that in the whole restitution debate, countries such as Indonesia should draw the initiative to themselves. They should take the initiative. And the third thing is that, you know, we were talking about the relationship with sultanates, and you can have your doubts and this and that, but also with them start doing provenance research and see whether you can build up a relationship of trust. And then in that process, if you start to trust each other, you also become more open about your own limitations, and you can discuss it openly. You see that also in restitution discussions with other countries. You know, if you're open about your own, if you build trust, you can be more open about your weaknesses. And then you can discuss, well, maybe it's too early if it comes back to the Sultanate. So keep it for 10 years in Jakarta, and we will be sure that we are ready. You know, in going back to the Benin objects, they're building now a museum in Benin City, which has to be ready in 2025. And then the Nigerians, you know, they want to be ready to welcome them back and to really exhibit them. That's my word. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. The trust is a very important thing. So it's about time that there's trust between the Netherlands and Indonesia, because it has never existed so far. So it's let's start with that. And thank you very much, all of you, for attending and for speaking and giving your thoughts on this. And I give the word now to Jus, who organized everything, and she can make some final organizing remarks.
Thank you. I can just only laugh. It's been very thought-provoking and then 2 hours long discussion. I'm amazed with all the speaker who is, you know, and all of you has been participating from the last 5. This is the 5th Decolonizing Museum events that have been put forward. The whole aim was to bring the Indonesian audience and the Dutch audience. I think we have succeeded so far. But then now I put the baton to each of you. If you have any question, you have all here, we will relay your message, your initiative back to the Netherlands. Just email us whenever what you need, or just link between your museum to the Dutch museum, be that with the university as well. Just we are here for you. So thank you for being with us, and thank you for all my speakers today. And thanks to you, Michel. You bring out the whole very dynamic and smooth conversation for today without realizing we've been doing it for 2 hours. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Makasih, Mbak.